The bank ledger lay open on the kitchen table like something nobody wanted to touch, and Silas Hargrove set down his coffee cup without once looking at his daughter. "Sell the ranch," he said, and he set it to the wood grain of the table he had built with his own hands 23 years back. Not to Adeline, not really to anyone in the room at all. The words landed the way a dropped plate does, sudden and past mending. Across from him sat Otis Grady, the bank's man out of Cedar Bluff, his hat already resting on his knee as though the matter had been settled before anyone spoke it aloud. Beside Grady, filling the doorway with his shoulders, stood Gideon Cole, who ran the spread on the far side of Timber Creek, and whom the valley called Hard because nobody could recall him asking for anything twice. Adeline stood at the stove with a wooden spoon still in her hand and flour on her sleeve, and for the space of several breaths, nobody in that kitchen seemed to remember she was standing there at all. 2 winters of dead calves and a dry well had brought them to this table. She had known the sale was coming. She had not known her father would say the word before he ever looked her way, as though the ranch her own mother was buried on belonged to him alone to give away. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. You'll want her signature too, Grady said, tapping the paper with one finger. Land still half in the mother's name, way the old deed reads. Silas rubbed his jaw and did not turn around. She'll sign what needs signing, he said. Adeline set the spoon on the stove rail and wiped her hands on her apron and said nothing at all, because there was nothing yet worth saying, and because 18 years on this land had taught her that a woman who spoke too soon in a room full of men gave away the only advantage her silence still held. Adeline Hargrove was 24 years old and had run Hargrove Range in every way that mattered since the winter her father's hands started shaking too badly to hold a branding iron. She kept the real ledger hidden inside the flour bin, not the one Grady had just laid on the table, and she alone knew which columns told the truth about how close to ruin they had actually come. She knew because she had written every figure herself by lamplight after her father went to bed, carrying numbers in her head the way other women carried recipes, because somebody in that house had needed to know what the herd was worth before the bank did. Her mother, Eleanor, had died the spring Adeline turned 11 and was buried under the cottonwood at the top of the north pasture, where a fence post still carried the letters E.H. carved by Silas the week after the funeral and never touched since. Adeline visited that post most mornings, before the sun cleared the ridge, the way she might report for duty to somebody who deserved a full account of how things stood. She had heard plenty about Gideon Cole over the years, most of it from men who resented how fast Cole's Crossing had grown, while their own outfits struggled, and none of it matched the 2 times she had actually spoken with him herself. Once at a barn raising 2 summers back, when he had spent an hour teaching her youngest hand how to set a post without splitting it, refusing every offer of thanks. Once at her mother's grave itself, the autumn before last, when she had found him standing at the fence line with his hat off, having ridden the long way around simply to pay respects to a woman he had met only twice in his life. She had never told anyone that. It had not seemed like a thing that belonged to anyone but her. The debt itself had crept up slow, the way debt does on a cattle operation, one bad season compounding into the next until there was no single week anyone could point to and say, "There, that was the mistake." A blizzard in the winter of '83 had taken nearly a third of the herd. The following summer brought a drought that turned Timber Creek to a trickle a man could step across without wetting his boot. Silas had borrowed against the spring calving to cover the note, then borrowed again in the fall when the calving came in light, and by the time Otis Grady rode out from Cedar Bluff with his ledgers and his sympathetic voice, there was no borrowing left to be done. Adeline understood the arithmetic better than her father did, which was precisely why she had spent the better part of a year steering every decision she could toward solvency, without ever once being asked her opinion outright. She had sold off 2 mares nobody would miss. She had talked Silas out of buying a new plow they could not afford. She had taken in mending from 3 ranches over, just to keep coin in the tin behind the flour bin, work she never mentioned at supper, because her father's pride could not have stood the sight of it. None of that had been enough, and she had known for months it would not be. But knowing a thing and hearing your own father say it plain across a kitchen table were 2 different kinds of hurt entirely. Grady cleared his throat and reached for the second sheet of paper, the one that named a figure the bank would pay for the acreage, once the note was cleared, a sum small enough that even Silas flinched reading it upside down. Cole's offering fair value for the water rights on top of that, Grady went on, nodding toward Gideon as though presenting a prize bull at auction. More than fair, considering the state of things. As for the house and the girl, he added, not looking at Adeline either, my sister runs a respectable boarding house in Cedar Bluff. Miss Hargrove's handy with a needle, I hear. There'd be a place for her there. Room and board. Decent wage doing mending and washing for the traveling men. Nobody in that kitchen asked Adeline whether mending strangers' shirts in a boarding house 40 miles from her mother's grave sounded like a life she wanted. It did not occur to any of them that the question was hers to answer at all. Gideon had said almost nothing since he walked through the door, which was, Adeline had come to understand from the barn raising, simply how the man operated. He watched the room the way he watched weather, waiting to see which direction it would break before he committed to anything. His eyes had gone to her exactly twice since Grady started talking, both times when her father spoke over her as if she were a piece of furniture that happened to be listening, and both times something had moved behind his expression that Adeline could not quite name and did not have leisure to study, not with the whole of her future being divided up on the table in front of her like a cut of beef. Sign here, Grady said, sliding the paper toward Silas and setting an inkwell beside it as if the matter required no further ceremony. Outside, through the open window, Adeline could hear Ezra Boone, who had worked Hargrove Range since before she was born, moving slow and deliberate around the corral, finding reasons to stay within earshot of a conversation that was, in its way, about to decide whether he still had a job to keep. Silas picked up the pen and set it down again twice before he managed to hold it steady. I never wanted this, he said, to no one in particular, or perhaps to the ghost of his wife under the cottonwood, who had loved this ground the way some women love a person. I built this place for you, Addie, he said, finally turning enough to look at her straight on for the first time since she had entered the room that morning. I built it so you'd have something. Seems all I've managed is to lose it out from under you instead. There was real grief in it, and Adeline felt her chest tighten with something that was not quite anger and not quite forgiveness either, because a man could be sorry and still be about to sign her whole life away in the same breath, and both of those things could be true at once. You could have asked me, she said, low and even, the first words she had spoken since the men arrived. What I wanted. Silas's hand went still over the paper. Asked you what, Addie? There's a banknote and a dry well. Ain't much room in that for asking. There's always room, Adeline said. You just have to think a body's opinion is worth the time it takes to hear it. Grady, sensing the room shifting in a direction that had nothing to do with signatures and deadlines, cleared his throat again. No disrespect meant, Miss Hargrove. Ranching's a hard business for a man to keep afloat, let alone hand off to a daughter. Your father's only looking out for your welfare here, seeing you settled somewhere respectable instead of watching this place finish the job the winters started. He said it the way men said such things when they believed themselves to be kind, and perhaps he did believe it, which somehow made it land harder rather than softer. Adeline felt the old, familiar urge rise in her, the one that had gotten her exactly nowhere in 24 years of being told what a woman ought to want. And for once, she did not swallow it whole. I have run this ranch's books since I was 17 years old, she said. I have pulled calves in a blizzard with my bare hands, while my father slept off a fever, and I have fed every hand on this place through 2 winters that should have broken us. I do not need settling, Mr. Grady. I need somebody in this room to remember I have a stake in what happens to my own mother's land. Outside, Ezra Boone had stopped pretending to work altogether and stood with his forearms crossed over the top rail, watching the kitchen window without shame. Gideon Cole, for his part, had not said one word through any of it, but Adeline caught him watching her now, with the same careful attention he had once given a green colt he was deciding whether to trust with a saddle. The truth, which nobody at that table had said outright, was that Gideon Cole did not particularly want the house, or the herd, or even most of the acreage. What he wanted was the stretch of Timber Creek that ran through Hargrove land before it crossed onto his own. Water that had been dividing the 2 ranches in dry years, since before either family arrived in the territory. Buying the whole spread outright, dead and all, had been Grady's idea, a tidy solution for the bank that left Cole holding land he would likely lease straight back to whoever worked it, and left Silas Hargrove with nothing but a settlement check in a room at his sister's in Laramie. Adeline had worked this out for herself 2 nights earlier, sitting with the hidden ledger open on her knees by lamplight, turning the numbers over until they told her exactly what everyone else in that kitchen already understood and had simply not bothered explaining to her. It is not really about the whole ranch at all, is it? She said now, looking past her father to Gideon directly for the first time. It is about the water. Gideon's jaw tightened, the closest thing to a reaction he had shown all morning. It's about the water, he agreed. And your father's note, and a bank that wants the debt cleared clean rather than carried another season. I never asked for the house, Miss Hargrove. Grady structured it that way because it was simpler for the paperwork. Then unstructure it, Adeline said. For a moment nobody spoke. Silas looked between his daughter and the man he had known for 6 years as a fair if unsociable neighbor, and something like understanding began, slow and unwilling, to surface on his face. Grady, who had clearly not anticipated the daughter having opinions worth stopping the proceedings for, glanced at the clock on the wall as if it might rescue him. It's a bit late in the morning to be redrafting contracts, Miss Hargrove, he said. The bank expects this settled by week's end. Then settle it right, Adeline said, and there was no heat in her voice at all, only the flat certainty of a woman who had spent 2 years doing sums nobody thanked her for. Because I am not moving to a boarding house in Cedar Bluff to mend strangers' shirts while a man I have met exactly twice takes the only water this valley has ever fought over and calls it a fair price. Silas set the pen down entirely now, and for the first time that morning he looked less like a man defeated by weather and debt, and more like a man beginning, too late by half, to see his own daughter clearly. Addie, he started, but she was already moving, crossing the kitchen to stand beside the table, rather than behind the stove, close enough that Grady had to look up at her rather than past her. Ezra Boone had drifted from the corral fence to the open door without anyone inviting him, hat in his hands now, the way a man stands when he suspects he is about to witness something he will be asked to tell the story of for years afterward. Gideon had not moved from the doorway, but something in his stance had shifted, weight settling back onto his heels, the posture of a man who had stopped watching the weather and started watching one particular cloud. Grady, sensing he had lost control of a room he had walked into fully expecting to control, tried once more to steer things back toward the paper. The terms are the terms, Miss Hargrove. The bank isn't in the business of renegotiating structure 2 hours before a signing. If your father wants to sell, and he's told me plainly that he does, then the water rights transfer with the deed, same as everything else. That is between the bank and my father's signature, Adeline said, and I am not part of the bank's arrangement. My mother's name is still on half this land, which means my name is on half this land, which means nothing gets signed here today, without my say-so regardless of what hour it is, or how inconvenient my opinions prove to your paperwork. Grady's mouth opened and closed once, and for a moment the only sound in the kitchen was the creak of Ezra's boots shifting in the doorway, and, somewhere out past the corral, a colt kicking at its stall. Silas found his voice first. Addie, what exactly are you proposing? Adeline did not answer her father. She turned instead to Gideon Cole, who had watched the entire exchange without once looking away from her, and she found that her hands, which had been shaking faintly since the moment her father said the word sell, had gone perfectly steady. You want the water, she said to him. Fine. You can have the water, and the note cleared, and every acre of grazing you need to run your herd through a dry summer without crossing my father's fence to beg for it. My price for it is a wedding. My name changed to yours on the same deed that carries both our herds, both of us standing on this porch when the sun comes up tomorrow, and every morning after. I will not be sent off to mend strangers' shirts in a boarding house 40 miles from my mother's grave, while a man I have met exactly twice takes the only water this valley has ever fought over and calls it a fair price. Grady let out a short, disbelieving laugh that died fast when nobody else in the room joined him. Silas stared at his daughter as though seeing, for the first time in 2 years of hard winters, exactly who had been holding this ranch together the whole while. And Gideon Cole, who the valley called hard because he never asked for anything twice, said nothing at all, only crossed the kitchen in 4 unhurried steps, and stopped close enough that Adeline had to tip her chin to hold his eyes. For 3 full seconds nobody in that kitchen breathed, not Grady with his ruined paperwork, not Ezra frozen in the doorway, with his hat crushed against his chest, not even Silas, who had gone entirely still in his chair as though watching a storm decide, at the very last moment, which direction it meant to break. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Say it plain, Miss Hargrove, Gideon said, low enough that it seemed meant for her alone, though every soul in the kitchen heard it. Tell me what you're asking for, because I've built a decent life out of not guessing at things." Adeline held his gaze and did not let her voice shake. "Not until you marry me first," she said. "That is my price for the water, Mr. Cole, and for my father's note, and for whatever is left standing on this land once the ink dries. A wedding, or there is no sale at all, and you can find your water rights some other way, because I will not be moved off ground my mother is buried in like a piece of furniture too worn out to keep." The words hung in the kitchen the way smoke hangs after a rifle shot, and for a long moment, Gideon Cole simply looked at her, his expression carrying the particular stillness Adeline had come to understand as a man weighing something with more care than most men bothered to spend on anything. Otis Grady found his voice first, sputtering something about irregular arrangements and proper procedure, and Silas Hargrove made a small strangled sound that might have been a laugh or might have been the beginning of tears, but neither man's reaction seemed to reach Gideon at all. He took his hat off. That, in itself, told Adeline something, because in 2 years of knowing him even slightly, she had never once seen Gideon Cole remove his hat indoors for anyone but the dead. "I've been riding out past your mother's grave for going on 2 years now," he said, and it took him a moment to get the rest out, as though the words had been waiting a long while for permission. "Told myself it was for the view. Told myself a lot of things. If you're asking whether I'd rather have you standing beside me on this land than a signature on a deed I bought off a bank, then you already know my answer, Miss Hargrove, and you knew it before you said a word of that." He paused, and something in his face eased, the hardness the valley talked about dropping away like a coach shed at the end of a long ride. "Then it's settled," he said. "We'll want the preacher out from Cedar Bluff, and your father standing up with us, if he's willing." Nobody in the kitchen moved for a long moment. Even the colt outside had gone still. Silas Hargrove put his face in his hands, and when he lifted it again there were tears on it that he made no effort to hide, which was, Adeline would think later, the most honest thing she had seen from her father in longer than she cared to admit. "I meant to save you from watching this place fail," he said, his voice cracking on the last word. "Seems instead I nearly signed away the one thing that was already saving it." Adeline crossed to him and put a hand on his shoulder, the gesture carrying more forgiveness than either of them had words for yet. Otis Grady, meanwhile, had gathered his papers into an untidy stack, his sympathetic banker's manner replaced by something closer to bewilderment. "This isn't exactly how these arrangements are typically structured," he said to no one in particular. Ezra Boone, still in the doorway, let out a short bark of laughter that he tried and failed to swallow. "Reckon not much about this family's ever been typical, Otis," he said. "Best get used to it." Through the window, Adeline could see 2 more hands who had drifted in from the barn, drawn by whatever instinct tells working men that something worth watching is happening under a roof they are not invited into, standing at a respectful distance with their hats already off, as though the news had reached them on the wind before anyone said a word out loud. Silas rose from his chair slowly, the way a man rises when his knees have carried more than they were built for, and crossed the kitchen to stand in front of Gideon Cole with his hand extended. "I owe you an apology I don't rightly know how to give," he said. "I sat in rooms with you twice a year for 6 years, and never once asked what kind of man you were, beyond what the other ranchers said." Gideon took the offered hand. "You asked your daughter the same question about as often, from what I can tell," he said, and Silas had no answer for that, beyond a slow, rueful nod that carried more weight than a long speech might have. Adeline watched the exchange and felt something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight since the morning her father's hands first started shaking too badly to hold a branding iron. 2 winters, and what felt like a lifetime ago. Outside on the porch, the 2 hands who had drifted over from the barn were already talking low between themselves about what it would mean to work under one brand instead of 2. And by the time Adeline stepped out to hang the wash an hour later, word of the morning had already traveled as far as the Mercantile in Cedar Bluff. Carried on nothing faster than a hired man riding in for feed and unable to keep a story that good behind his teeth. She did not mind. A story told plain, she decided, was a poor enough thing to be ashamed of, and this one had her standing exactly where she meant to stand. It was Ezra who told her the rest of it 3 days later, while she was mending harness leather on the porch and trying not to watch the road for Gideon's dust, the way she had caught herself doing every afternoon since the kitchen table. "Cole paid down half your father's note back in the spring," Ezra said, matter of fact, like a man delivering weather. "Quiet arrangement with the bank in Laramie, not the branch here in Cedar Bluff. So Grady never got wind of it." Adeline set the harness down. Half the note. Ezra nodded. Didn't want it known, and didn't want your father feeling beholden, which is why he let Grady run his little foreclosure parade through here same as if nothing had changed. Man's proud in his own way, just proud about different things than most. Wanted the choice to be yours free and clear, not something you felt obliged toward on account of a favor already done. Adeline sat with that a long moment, turning it over the way she turned over a column of figures that would not balance until she found the one entry she had missed. It explained the 2 times she had caught him watching her with something more careful than curiosity. It explained why a man the valley called hard had ridden the long way around a fence line just to stand bareheaded at a stranger's grave. It explained, too, why Otis Grady had seemed almost relieved rather than put out once the shouting settled, since a man who has already collected half a debt in private has considerably less reason to fight over how the rest of it gets structured on paper. Adeline thought of every conversation she had sat through, believing herself entirely alone in the work of keeping Hargrove Range standing, and found she could not decide whether to be angry at the secrecy or grateful for it. So she let herself be a little of both and set the harness aside for the evening. She found Gideon that evening at the fence between their 2 properties, exactly where Ezra said he'd been riding for 2 years running, and she did not waste time with things that no longer needed saying between them. You could have told me, she said, about the note. He considered that, leaning on the top rail beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. Could have, he agreed. But a woman deserves to choose a man for himself, not for what he's already paid toward her debts. Figured you'd earned the right to pick freely, same as you'd earned everything else on this place nobody bothered crediting you for. Adeline reached over and, for the first time since the morning at the kitchen table, took his hand without either of them making a production of it. And when Otis Grady rode back out from Cedar Bluff a week later with the corrected papers, 1 deed instead of 2, both their names inked side by side above the line that used to read Silas Hargrove alone, Adeline made certain there was coffee waiting for him on the porch and no hard feelings carried into the pouring of it, because grudges, she had decided, cost more upkeep than a person like her had time to spend. Silas stayed on at the house through that first year, teaching the 2 new hands Gideon brought over from Cole's Crossing the particular stubbornness of the North Pasture's soil, and if his hands still shook some mornings, nobody in that kitchen ever again mistook the trembling for weakness. The wedding itself was a small thing, held on the porch of the house Adeline had grown up in, rather than the church in Cedar Bluff, because she had wanted her mother close for it in the only way that was still possible. Reverend Combs rode out from town on a Sunday in late September, and the ceremony took perhaps 15 minutes from start to finish, conducted in front of a gathering that amounted to Silas, Ezra Boone, 4 ranch hands from the 2 outfits now folding into one, Nettie Vance from the boarding house, who had come out of curiosity and stayed for the cake, and Otis Grady, invited more out of Adeline's stubborn insistence on grace than any particular fondness for the man. Nettie had brought a cake stacked 3 layers high with white icing that would not quite set in the September heat, and Ezra had spent the better part of the morning arguing with the 2 new hands over whether the porch rail could bear the weight of the bunting somebody had strung along it, without asking Silas first. None of it was fancy by the standards of a church wedding in Laramie, but Adeline had never much cared for fancy, and the plainness of it, folding chairs borrowed from the schoolhouse and coffee brewed strong enough to stand a spoon in, suited the ground it was standing on better than lace ever could have. She wore her mother's pearls, kept in a cedar box under the bed for 13 years, and never once worn, and when Reverend Combs asked whether she took Gideon Cole as her husband, she answered without a trace of the hesitation she had felt asking her own father, months back, to think of her as more than furniture in his own house. Afterward, when the small crowd had thinned and Ezra had gotten predictably sentimental over a second slice of cake, Adeline walked up to the cottonwood at the top of the North Pasture alone, in her wedding dress, with the hem gathering dust the way it had gathered dust on 100 ordinary mornings before. She sat with her back against the fence post carved with her mother's initials and told her, in the plain way she had always talked to that patch of ground, that the ranch was safe, that her father was still standing, that she had married a man who had ridden out here more than once, in secret, just to keep her mother company in a season nobody had asked him to. She told her that Hargrove Range was Cole's Crossing now, or maybe the other way around, that the hands had already started calling the whole of it simply the range, dropping both surnames, the way land eventually settles on whatever name feels most true. When Gideon found her there 20 minutes later, hat in hand as always at that particular fence line. He did not ask what she had been saying. He only sat down beside her in the grass and let the afternoon go still around them both. The kind of stillness Adeline had learned to trust because it never once, in all the months she had known him, come from a man with nothing left to say. That winter, the first one they weathered together, brought hard cold but no dead calves, no dry well, nothing the two ranches combined could not absorb between them. And by the time the first calves of spring dropped healthy in the new year, nobody in Cedar Bluff bothered calling Gideon Cole hard anymore. Not after the story of the kitchen table had made its way around every supper table in the valley twice over. Adeline kept her mother's cracked teacup on the shelf above the new stove Gideon had freighted in from Laramie as a wedding gift, and some mornings, standing at that stove with the kettle just starting to sing, she would catch her own reflection in the window glass and see, for just a moment, a woman who looked nothing at all like furniture, and everything like somebody who had chosen, with both eyes open, exactly the life she meant to keep. Silas took to sitting on that same porch most evenings once his chores were done, watching the two herds graze together on ground that no longer needed dividing, and more than once Adeline caught him talking low to the fence post under the cottonwood, as though giving his wife a full accounting of how things had turned out after all. Gideon never did stop riding the long way around that fence line, even after there was no longer any need for secrecy in it, and Adeline came to understand that some habits a man keeps are really a kind of promise, renewed each time the same quiet way, without ever needing to be spoken out loud again. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.